I'm Shane Graham. I'm a professor of English at Utah State University. I've been teaching college level literature and writing since 1996, and I also serve as the editor of an academic journal. I'm here to talk about thesis statements, and in particular, interpretive thesis statements. I teach in literature, but I think a lot of my advice would apply equally well to a paper that you write for any interpretive discipline. And this would include art history, film studies, musicology, anything where you have a text, whether a written text or a visual or audio text, in which you're offering your interpretation and your understanding of that text. I can't guarantee that every professor in the world would agree with 100% of the advice that I'm about to give you. They might emphasize different aspects of the thesis writing process or frame things slightly differently. But what I can tell you is that this is what I'm looking for in every kind of academic writing, from freshman composition to a graduate level seminar to essays submitted to the journal that I work for. What should a thesis statement do? It should offer an interpretive claim. What do I mean by that? An interpretive claim is one that needs to be proved and can be proved. You have to be able to muster evidence from the text that you're analyzing to support your claim, and you have to ground it in logical argumentation. A good thesis statement goes beyond a simple summary or just a statement of fact about the text. It should answer a how or why, or especially a so what question. And another way of putting that perhaps is that it should explain the meaning or the significance of the text as a whole, or of some particular aspect of the text that you're focusing on in your paper. Let me walk you through a few examples. Romeo and Juliet fall so deeply in love with each other that they each commit suicide for the other. Anyone who has seen the play or read it is going to say, yeah, that's what happens, all right. So this is really just offering a summary of the overall plot of the play. It is not rising to the level of a thesis statement or an interpretive claim. I would say the same about this one. Love is an important theme in Romeo and Juliet. Okay, so what does Shakespeare tell us about the theme? What do we learn about the nature of love or the power of love by reading or seeing this play performed? This thesis statement is not yet doing that work. Here's a version of that same thing that I see very frequently, and especially first drafts of student papers. And that's fair because you haven't written the paper yet, so you don't yet know what you want to say about it. But this is all the more reason to go back and revise your thesis statement once you've completed a draft of the paper. In this essay, I will discuss Shakespeare's vision of love in Romeo and Juliet. But again, it's not yet telling me, what is that vision of love? What do we learn about this subject by studying this play? A slightly better example. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare depicts love as a dangerous, all-consuming passion that drives its victims to reckless behavior. Now the student is beginning to offer a viewpoint, to articulate a value or an authorial perspective that we can see expressing itself through the play. Better yet, in Romeo and Juliet, even though love makes the title characters do crazy things, love is still the force that brings people together despite all obstacles. And I like this one in particular because it starts with a statement of the obvious or a understanding that most anyone who had read or seen the play would agree with, but then complicates it and offers the student's own perhaps more counterintuitive or less immediately obvious understanding of what's really being communicated through the play. This one I particularly like because it uses a formula that I have found very useful in teaching student writing over the years. It is a formula, it has limitations, but I think it also has a lot of power to help illuminate the text that you're writing about. The formula looks like this: although X, nevertheless Y. Even though this seems to be the case, it is nevertheless true that Y is the case. Let me walk you through some variations of this basic formula. While at first glance it may seem like blank, a close and careful reading shows that blank. So you started off thinking this, but you've read the play more carefully now, and you have concluded that it's more complicated than you first assumed. Another spin on that is when you're engaging other critics. And so if your professor is asking you to write a research paper in which you summarize what other critics have said about the play, you should then turn around and offer your own response, your own understanding of the text. Although most critics have argued blank, my argument to the contrary will be blank. And so you're filling in the blanks here with the obvious interpretation or the common critical consensus on a text, but then following it up with your own observations. While it is true that blank, the more important truth is blank. And so once you start filling in these gaps, you're coming much closer to offering your understanding, your interpretation of the text. Let me point out something in the second example on the screen here. My argument to the contrary will be blank. This might seem to contradict advice that I think many of you probably learned in high school. Never use I in a paper. I really wish that high school teachers would stop teaching their students that. It's true in some disciplines, I think, that that is the norm, that if you say, I believe this, or I will argue this, that you're inserting a subjective point of view in what should be an objective analysis. I think in a lot of the sciences and the social sciences, that rule of thumb is widely accepted and holds pretty true. But we're talking about interpretive thesis statements where what I'm looking for is the student's own reading, their own interpretation. And in particular, in this second formula, where you've just spent a paragraph or maybe an entire section of your paper summarizing what other critics have said, I think it's really important to say, to the contrary, I'm going to argue this, so that you're distinguishing your reading from what other critics have said about the subject. And sometimes you have to say I or my argument will be in order to make that distinction between what other people have said and how you're reading the text. Let me show you some quick real world examples. And some of these are actual published essays by professional scholars. Others are thesis statements that students have written for papers for me over the years. And I have asked those students permission to use their thesis statement as an example because I thought it did a really nice job of using this, although nevertheless formula. Throughout the play, Henri Christophe is chiefly depicted as a tyrant, insensitive to the oppressing demands he places upon his people. Yet upon closer inspection, several passages spoken by his subjects reveal him as an inspiration and influential leader. This contradiction suggests that Aimé Césaire, the playwright, while well aware of Christophe's tyrannical qualities, sees the king as an influential leader whose supposed qualities outweighed his overall oppressive rule. What I like about this thesis is that it's capturing the complexity of the text itself. A lot of texts, the texts that are most worthy of classroom study, are ones that are really hard to pin down, that seem to be wrestling with philosophical principles and questions in themselves. And so if you offer a simple statement of, this is what this play means, this is what this poem means, then you're not doing justice to the complexity of the text. This is a thesis statement that is trying to capture some of that complexity and trying to articulate the ambivalence and the nuance of the author's viewpoint, the author's value system. Some other quick examples from texts that you may or may not have read, but what I'm asking you to pay attention to is how these thesis statements use the although nevertheless formula. From Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Although Okonkwo's suicide seems to show him as weak, in reality, it reveals his inability to accept his clan's failure. And so the weakness is on the part of the society that has been colonized and oppressed rather than on the part of this individual character. And so this is a thesis statement that's, again, beginning to wrestle with the complexity of Achebe's viewpoint. This is from Max Novak's famous essay on the 18th century English novel Robinson Crusoe. Although most modern critics have regarded Crusoe as an embodiment of the enterprising, fearless economic man, Crusoe clearly belongs to the third category. He survives his solitude, but he is always afraid, always cautious. And so you can see of the three formulations of the although nevertheless formula that I offered, this is closest to the second one. He summarizes what other critics have said, establishes the critical consensus, but then says, but they're getting something wrong. They're missing the fear and the caution that drives Crusoe's behavior through that novel. While even Beckett's early work questioned the ability of language to truly communicate inner states, for example, in late works such as Not I, his characters show an almost schizophrenic incapacity to communicate ideas through language at all. And so again, starting with easily perceived understanding of the play, the author then offers a more complex understanding. And let me emphasize again that you don't usually start writing a paper with this kind of complexity already figured out. Writing a paper is the process of figuring out what you think about the text you're studying. And so this is the reason why you need to leave yourself plenty of time after you've written a first draft to take stock of what you've really said and to then go back to your introduction, look at the thesis statement and ask, is this really capturing the complexity of my argument and the complexity of the text that I'm studying? The answer is usually no. Usually you start with a thesis statement that looks like those early examples, right? I will discuss this theme in the story, but having then discussed and analyzed and looked really carefully at your examples from the text, you can then go back and offer a more sophisticated and a more nuanced understanding of what's really going on in the text. So let me emphasize again, the although nevertheless formula works really well for some papers, is more constricting and confining in other kinds of papers. So I don't want to offer it as the universal formula that you should use for every paper you write in college, but I do think that it's really useful for a lot of interpretive assignments. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have questions, feel free to email me at shane.graham@usu.edu, and I'll try to give you a succinct answer. Thanks for watching.